You may have seen that earlier this week, the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development called on the public to support the Anti-Racism Week from the 14th to today, the 21st of March. The purpose of the week is to condemn racism and also to mobilize all citizens to support the long-term anti-racism campaign in pursuit for a non-racial and free South Africa that belongs to all of us. The week is held annually during Human Rights Month. It also culminates on Human Rights Day, which is today, as I said, and also the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. It's about ensuring really that there is a countrywide focus on tackling racism and that it remains on the national agenda. For more on this now, let me welcome in studio Teresa Oakley-Smith. She is Managing Director at Diversi-T. Good afternoon. Good to have you on board.
Thank you so much, Palesa.
Thank you so much indeed. Well, looking back at what South Africa has achieved 25 years later, here we are still talking about racism. What is lacking?
You know, I think that first of all, I mean, although the initiative, the Anti-Racism Week, is an excellent initiative, and I think driven quite firmly by the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation, I don't think it's been taken up in any significant way. I mean, if you walk around, you don't see businesses doing work around this, or schools are actually on holiday during this week. So I think we failed to really embed the importance of understanding racism within the deep-seated culture of our country. You know, as whites, we tend to think if we don't use the K word and if we're nice to people, then we're not being racist. We don't understand, you know, the institutional nature of racism, and I think we need to start there. We need to start educating people, schools, universities. We need to educate people in the workplace, because that hasn't happened. We've talked a lot of hot air, actually, but we haven't, as a country, really got to grips with racism.
Yeah, we had the Minister of the Department of Justice, Michael Masuta, earlier in the week talking about the same issue, and I asked him as to whether are we having sufficient discussions on racism, or is it just a matter of thinking that these are uncomfortable discussions that we shouldn't be engaging in?
You know, my company, Diversi-T, that is the nature of our work. It's going into workplaces and having these discussions, these dialogues, and they can certainly, Palesa, be uncomfortable. But you know, people don't change until they feel a level of discomfort. And if we're going to gloss over everything and pretend that, you know, everyone gets along grinning at each other, we're not really going to tackle the beast. We have to be prepared to talk about it. We have to be prepared to engage with the discomfort if we're really going to begin to make a difference. Yeah.
And you were telling me of Teresa, that of course we've got to start somewhere. For example, we should be having these discussions in schools, tertiary institutions and so on. And my take really is kids do not really know anything about racism. They play very well with other races, and the problem is when they get home, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think that, you know, we often delude ourselves into thinking that children don't see these things. We have to remember that children don't do what they hear, they do what they see. So maybe Jane plays with Sipho at school, but does she ever see Sipho's parents interacting with her parents at home? Does she ever see people of another race in her home? I mean, a recent work by the Institute of Justice and Reconciliation shows that it's something like 37%, a very small amount of South Africans who ever engage people of other races in their homes or socially. And that means that as South Africans, we're not having any same status contact. We're still stuck in the place where, for most white people, our main interaction with black people is from a level of superiority, where we're looking at people who work for us. And for black people, the same kind of applies. They're in the workplace, people might engage on a very superficial level, but there isn't that real preparedness to tackle the difficult issues together and to facilitate the dialogues that we need to have. I mean, New Zealand was, I mean, who would have thought New Zealand? But it's provided such an example to us this week with the way their whole country has come together to mourn those terrible killings, those terrorist killings in the mosques. And somehow we don't see South Africans getting together in the same way.
The policies are there on a piece of paper, obviously, but many people are saying the implementation part is what the problem is. But we've seen, I think, the first successful prosecution of Vicky Moberg, and that gave hope to many South Africans that this will deter other racists from engaging in such acts?
You know, I think when you say the policies are there, I mean, I think the policies are not there. In many companies, there are no policies around racism or discrimination. And it's one of those subjects that people would prefer to put under the carpet or not address. And I think that makes it very difficult for employees who are bearing the brunt of racist behavior, because they don't have any way with which to deal with it. So I think not only do we not have sufficient policy, but we also don't have processes. So, you know, even on that very systemic level, we don't have a way of engaging with race.
Yeah, but why do we not have those policies in the workplaces, for example?
Well, they should be there. I mean, under the guidance of the Employment Equity Act and the codes of good practice, they should be there. But, you know, I think the trouble is that businesses don't really see anti-racism work and diversity work for what it is. It's a bottom line issue. If people are comfortable in the workplace, if they get along with one another, if there is an absence of discrimination and racism, it impacts positively on productivity. And so businesses often think, oh, well, this is a nice to have. And if we have a free day, we'll do a sort of one day of this kind of thing. Yeah. But they're not prepared to embed it properly in their business culture, and therefore see the rewards that really changing people's behavior and improving people's relationships can bring.
Yeah, but in terms of the law, do you think that we need a law that would criminalize both hate crimes and hate speech?
Well, I think that law is very much on the way. I mean, we have that. We have an equality court. And we had that first instance that you described. But it can't just be about the law. You know, the law is important, obviously, and people want to feel that there's some, you know, retribution for racist kind of behavior. But, you know, very often racism can be, it can be conscious, it can also be unconscious. It can be deliberate, it can also be accidental. But unless we educate people about what is and what is not racism, they're not going to be able to even begin to think about how to stop it.
So I suppose it's going to take quite a while to get rid of racism. As you say, it's deeply rooted in one's minds, for example. So it's not something that will eventually go away.
Well, you know, I think if we just leave it to this evolutionary process, it could take forever. But I think what's needed is a very firm line taken, a firm expectation in schools. It should be in the curriculum, Palesa. It should be part of university courses. It should be compulsory for all businesses to engage with their employees in this kind of way. Yeah. So I think there needs to be far more certainty about it and far more insistence, and also consequences, accountability. Consequences for these kind of things, not just for the person who uses the K word, but for the business where this has happened, for the company where it's happened. What does that say about your company if people are using this kind of language to one another? So without policies, without accountability, I think, you know, we're going to be having the same conversation a couple of years from now.
True. And when you look at the latest spate of racism, can we really ever be a non-racial South Africa?
You know, we really need to be. And of course, racism is also, it involves all the races in our country. And the kind of discrimination also includes things like xenophobia.
Because the reality is you have blacks who are racists as well. It's not just whites.
Well, I think you know, that would be a matter of debate, because the power still somehow lies in the white superiority or the feeling of white superiority. But there's certainly discrimination of various kinds, and it seems to be widespread in South Africa. I mean, the recent issues around Indian South Africans and African South Africans shows us that it's not just a white-black issue, but it permeates all levels of our society in all ways.
Teresa, time constraints, we have to leave it at this, but thank you so much for coming through, and hopefully we'll not be having this discussion again anytime soon. Thank you so much.
Well, I'd love to meet you again, but not under these circumstances.
Not on this topic, yes, indeed, of course. Teresa Oakley-Smith is the Managing Director at Diversi-T. Looking back at the 25 years South Africa has had in terms of fighting racism. All right, let's now catch you up with some of the